Now we can introduce our next presenter, who is Anne Zulawski, and she's the Sydenham C. Parsons Professor Emerita of History and Latin American Studies at Smith College. She's the author of the book Unequal Cures, Public Health and Political Change in Bolivia, 1900 to 1950, and The Eat from Their Labor, Work and Social Change in Colonial Bolivia. Her recent research focuses on the connections between the environment, urban development, colonialism, and public health in Puerto Rico, and in the Puerto Rico community in New York City. A current project is the history of Puerto Rico radicalism in New York City between the 1920s and the 1950s. Let's all welcome Anne Zulawski. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Here you can see the title of what I'm going to talk about, and I'll just jump right in. There's Puerto Rico. In June of 1912, authorities in Puerto Rico reluctantly admitted that there was bubonic plague in the city of San Juan and that the disease was taking on epidemic proportions. Most of the cases and the first ones diagnosed were in a working class neighborhood of San Juan, here's San Juan, known as Puerta de Tierra. Here's a map of Puerta de Tierra. Bubonic plague apparently spread from the docks in Puerta de Tierra, in this area, and it was believed to have been brought in on a ship from somewhere else, but no one was really sure from where. There were a lot of proposals. The epidemic caused alarm bordering on panic, and this alarm focused on the residents of this neighborhood, Puerta de Tierra, especially the Afro-Puerto Ricans who lived there, who were among the poorest people in what was admittedly a modest neighborhood. So my talk is a case study, and it focuses on the history of urbanization in Puerta de Tierra, environmental racism, and the stigma associated with bubonic plague in Puerto Rico. And it examines how years of neglect of public health and environmental abuse of Puerta de Tierra came back to haunt the government and the people of the island in the form of a terrifying epidemic, and how the epidemic actually exacerbated racial and class divisions. It also highlights the contradictory the social results of contradictory medical understandings of the plague. I only actually draw a few comparisons to COVID-19, but I think they're quite obvious, and it's something that we may want to talk about later in the discussion. Also, I haven't included a bibliography here except in my footnotes, but I will send in some books, a list of books and articles that are both appropriate for teachers and students before our Monday meeting. So last week you had the benefit of Professor Varlick's excellent presentation on bubonic plague. I feel like if it's, here we are, another Wednesday and more bubonic plague. So I'm only going to quickly review some salient points about the disease. The illness that became evident in San Juan in 1912 was part of what's generally referred to as the third international plague epidemic that first struck China in 1894 and then traveled around most of the world and finally abated by at least 1950. Plague in epidemic proportions is most commonly spread to humans by rats or other small mammals that are suffering from Yersinia pestis. And that's the Yersinia pestis is a rodent disease, and the vector is a flea that bites a human. And the most common or the most effective vector is Xenothila chiopus. Don't ask me to ever pronounce that again. The bubonic plague takes its name from the characteristic swellings or buboes that are often found in the groin area or under the patient's arms. And they're the most common means of clinical diagnosis of the disease. Plague or bubonic plague is not generally spread from person to person, except in a relatively rare and very virulent secondary form where the disease settles in the lungs. And when that happens, then plague can be transmitted from person to person through respiratory droplets. But this was not the case in Puerto Rico. This was bubonic plague transmitted by a vector. Although plague is not commonly spread from human to human, its dissemination is made possible by human action, particularly the shipping of grains and other foodstuffs, shipping of cloth that may have fleas in them, and get transported to new venues. Consequently, the outbreak that began in 1894, the first areas that were affected were ports. And in fact, one of the best known books about that epidemic is Myron Eckenberg's Plague Ports, where he talks about plague going from Hong Kong to Bombay to Buenos Aires to San Francisco and so forth. By the time the plague reached Puerto Rico in 1912, scientific knowledge of the disease had advanced considerably since the mid-19th century. And although it was generally accepted that it was spread by a vector from animals to humans, there was still debate about what animals could be infected and also what the vectors might be. Some people thought cats and dogs frequently carried fleas that could spread plague. Some people wondered if mosquitoes and flies could be the vectors. And to some extent, these things are still discussed about plague. Especially about what animals can transport it, can transmit it. But more importantly, at this time in 1912, there were educated people, and including doctors, who contended that the disease spread from in two other ways. One was through noxious miasmas, that is, vaporous emanations from marshy regions or from putrefying matter. And the other way that some people still believed it was spread was through direct contagion from person to person. So an examination of what happened during 1912 in Puerto Rico tends to indicate that part of the widespread public fear and some policy decisions were the result of these older ideas, either the contagionist ideas or miasmic theories about how the disease was spread. And that these ideas, the idea of contagion and miasmic spread, became intertwined with prejudice against the poor, dark-skinned people of Puerta de Tierra. Now, just back up for a minute and say that, yes, of course, a person whose clothes may be infested with fleas can spread the disease. But what happened in the case of this epidemic was that the people of Puerta de Tierra themselves were viewed as contagious or as part of a festering environmental danger. Okay. Puerta de Tierra, the name Puerta de Tierra, and here you can see it again, dates from the time when the capital city of San Juan, or what's now often referred to as Old San Juan, was a walled colonial capital. And Old San Juan and Puerta de Tierra shared this small island, or isleta, that is connected to the rest of the city of San Juan and to the rest of the island of Puerto Rico by bridges. In the Spanish colonial period, there were there was a wall around the city, as I said, and there were 6 gates in this wall, huge, huge gates that were locked at night to protect the city from attack. And this is the last remaining gate or wall in part of what still remains of the wall that surrounded the city. The Puerta de Santiago, this is one of the gates in an old photograph, was the gate that led from San Juan. And when I say San Juan, I'm talking about the area that now is sometimes referred to as Old San Juan. So this was a gate that led from San Juan to the next section of this small island, and then to the rest of Puerto Rico. And it was called the Puerta de Santiago, but it was often just referred to as the land gate or the land door, the Puerta de Tierra. So the neighborhood took its name from the door. Just for give you an idea, the neighborhood of Puerta de Tierra today is about half a square mile in size. The location of Puerta de Tierra in relation to the city of San Juan made it different from other cities where there were plague epidemics. The docks and warehouses of Puerta de Tierra sat squarely between San Juan, the capital, and the rest of the island. So while not everybody in San Juan itself was wealthy and there was poor housing conditions there, and to some extent, it still was a center of government, and many elite and prosperous and well-known families lived there. So residents of San Juan had to cross Puerta de Tierra to leave this small island and to go anywhere else on the island. Puerta de Tierra grew slowly in the early and mid-19th century. In 1838, excuse me, there were only 168 people reported to live there, 156 free people, and 12 slaves, and 61% of these people were said to be people of color. In 1867, the government auctioned off housing lots in Puerta de Tierra. Most of these lots were purchased by speculators who didn't intend to live there themselves, but who saw a possibility for building houses and renting to increasing numbers of workers who were coming into the city to work. Workers began coming in greater numbers in 1873 with the abolition of slavery. And then in the late 19th century, the sugar industry on the island went into a long decline, and that brought more people into the city looking for work. At the beginning of US control of the island in 1899, the population of Puerta de Tierra was about 5,500 people. And the area's population reached a peak around 1920 when 16,000 people, more or less, lived there, a lot of whom had come to work in recently built tobacco factories. So this is probably a good point to say something about Puerto Rico as a US colony. Because I just mentioned the US control. It's interesting to consider whether being a US colony had implications or influenced how the disease was dealt with. And here might be able to compare it to what happened in Peru, which you read about in the article by Marcos Cueto. Anyway, US colonialism, a brief review. In 1898, the United States intervened militarily in Cuba's war for independence from Spain. As a result of that intervention, the United States won the war, basically, and they gained control over two other Spanish colonies, the Philippines and Puerto Rico. After US intervention, Puerto Rico neither became independent, as Cuba eventually did, nor was it officially incorporated into the United States. In fact, this was an era of virulent racism in the United States at the end of radical Reconstruction after the Civil War. And there was considerable racist political opposition to fully incorporating a territory whose population included many people of color. So Puerto Rico was occupied militarily until 1900 And then in 1900, oh, there's a picture of old San Juan. You can see that classy neighborhood. Sorry, I forgot to show that before. In 1900, the United States organized a civilian, but not a representative government under what was known as the Foraker Act. Under the Foraker Act, a governor, a cabinet, and a 5-member Supreme Court were all appointed by the US president. There was a bicameral legislature, and one of these houses was made up of 11 men who were also appointed by the US president. And then there was also a 35-member House of Delegates who were elected every 2 years by Puerto Rican men. Puerto Ricans eventually were made US citizens in 1917 under the Jones Act. There were a couple, it was not an accident that this happened in 1917, although there had been various cases brought up about what exactly the status of Puerto Ricans was. But the 1917, the United States was about to enter the First World War, and they wanted to guarantee Puerto Rican support in the war, and more importantly, if Puerto Rican men became citizens, they could be and were drafted into the US Army to fight in the war. So the Jones Act gave the islands slightly more local representative government, but the Puerto Rican government could only legislate on purely local matters. It couldn't make any decisions about trade or foreign policy or anything like that. And the governor and all the other important political positions were still appointed by the US president. So citizenship allowed Puerto Ricans to travel to the US, but it didn't give them the representation or the rights of citizens that citizens of US states had. So in any event, you can see the Bubonic Plague occurred right between these two acts, and when even before Puerto Ricans were US citizens. So housing and disease. By the 1890s, tenements, often referred to as ranchones, became the most common type of housing in the area. This was a kind of building that these speculators who bought land built. Most of them were 1 or 2 story high. They were made of wood. They were divided into a number of 2-room apartments, going back from the doors that you can see there. In the 1890s, the average room measured about 73 square feet. And just to give you some basis for comparison, if you're not familiar with thinking in square feet, an average hotel room now, not a fancy one, is about 300 square feet. So you can see how small these rooms were. Another kind of housing in Puerta de Tierra that was even less desirable than these were cellars that were just kind of scooped out underneath buildings that just had dirt floors and no windows. And they were often referred to as caves. Basically, there were 2 residential areas in Puerta de Tierra. One of them went along what was known as the highway, or La Carretera, which is now Avenida Ponce de Leon, and the parallel Calle San Agustin. Especially the Calle San Agustin had a lot of houses, had a lot of ranchones, had a lot of food storage places. It was certainly not a elegant or spacious neighborhood by any means, but it was considered the more desirable place to live because it was on relatively high ground. It got ocean breezes, there were breezes blowing across the island, and it was dry. people who lived here, these were the more prosperous people in the neighborhood. They were factory workers, usually tobacco factory workers and their families. A man working in a tobacco factory in this period might earn between $6 and $18 a week. So those were the people who were well off. The poorest people in Puerta de Tierra lived down here in the south, in an area that was crowded with shacks and extremely swampy, areas that flooded when the tide came in. So many houses in this zone were actually raised on poles to prevent the water from coming in at high tide. The poorest people in Puerta de Tierra tended to live here in several small communities. Here's an example of one. The most memorable one, the one that most people always refer to, is one called Sal si puedes, which means leave if you can. And this is a picture of Sal si puedes. So this area was mostly populated by day laborers. Some of the least skilled people in the tobacco factories worked here, many of whom were women. They might earn between $2 and $3 a week. And this lowland area, is interesting, was also the home to many laundresses who somehow managed to produce brilliantly clean, starched and ironed clothing for the ladies and gentlemen of San Juan, even though you can see they weren't living in an environment that looks very conducive to producing beautifully done laundry. But the US Bureau of Labor report for 1912, that's the year of the epidemic, estimated that about a quarter of the women of Puerta de Tierra worked as laundresses and that they earned between $1 and $1.50 a day. And the vast majority of the people who lived in these southern slums were Black. So, like the officially condemned but unofficially tolerated unhygienic housing conditions, there were other serious environmental problems in Puerta de Tierra. And even in an age of poor sewage systems and poor systems of waste disposal, some of the conditions in the neighborhood were truly shocking. And so the government often condemned them, but they were very seldom corrected. The unplanned development in Puerta de Tierra seemed to be encouraged by the belief that the neighborhood was still thinly settled. Remember the early 1800s, there were very few people there. And also encouraged by the fact that there were very few or wealthy or educated residents who might object if the neighborhood was used for various purposes that were considered undesirable or unacceptable in other parts of the city. So while the term environmental racism was coined in the last decades of the 20th century to describe the contamination of neighborhoods primarily occupied by people of color, many of the actions that contributed to the degradation of Puerta de Tierra might be understood as an example of this kind of policy. The term just wasn't used then. And fundamentally, the same practices prevailed under the Spanish and the US administrations. And I'll just mention a few examples of the uses and abuses of Puerta de Tierra. Under the Spanish in 1889, a quarantine barracks for people suffering from Hansen's disease or leprosy was located in the low-lying area, the low-lying marshy area near Sal si puedes. And you have to remember that this time Hansen's disease was thought to be extremely contagious and that it warranted complete quarantine. So people were very afraid of people who had the disease. The barracks was located to the south of the municipal jail, which was on La Carretera. That's the wrong picture. We can get back to that in a minute. Anyway, also in back of the municipal jail was the city's main garbage dump And Puerta de Tierra also was one of the main areas of the city where there were stables. And most of the stables were completely unhygienic. They were sometimes under people's apartments, in lean-tos next to houses. They often had fodder and food for the horses lying around that rats could get into. In 1902, the municipal government allocated land, again adjacent to the municipal jail, for the construction of an animal quarantine hospital. And at this time, the horse disease, glanders, was fairly common, and horses got sick and died from it. And sometimes people who worked with horses also contracted glanders. Then there was another problem, and that was how to dispose of the bodies of animals once they died. And both of the methods of disposal that were used were increasingly viewed as unacceptable, but no alternative had been found. One was throwing the carcasses into the water off the north side of the neighborhood. The problem with this was that it was open ocean, and the carcasses eventually washed back to shore. And this is an example of the kind of water. The other alternative was throwing the carcasses into the low-lying water in the poorest areas of Puerta de Tierra. But that was no longer considered possible because people lived there and people bathed in the water. I just want to see. Well, I'll show you later. After the US occupation, US medical officers attempted to reorient public health norms according to US practices. And what they did was they emphasized attacking particular diseases that had been very serious for people in Puerto Rico all along, but now threatened the US citizens, the new arrivals from the United States. So within 10 to 15 years, campaigns by US medical officers based on the new science of parasitology succeeded in reducing malaria and hookworm. However, particularly malaria, the eradication of which requires environmental cleanup and destroying mosquitoes and their larvae, continued to be a scourge for Puerta de Tierra into the 20th century. One aspect of this environment in Puerta de Tierra that everyone agreed was unhealthy and should be done away with were the manglares, or mangroves, mangrove jungles or mangrove swamps that grew in the relatively shallow water around this poorest south and southeastern part of the neighborhood. But public health officials, and there's a picture of mangroves, public health officials seem to have an ambivalent attitude towards the mangroves. On the one hand, there was no shortage of reports certifying that miasms rising from the mangroves were the cause of malaria, typhoid, and all kinds of other diseases. It was also reported that rats lived in them. Yet many people seem to have little awareness of how government-approved uses of the mangroves contributed to environmental degradation and disease. In 1894, for instance, the local government suggested throwing the city's garbage in the mangroves at the end of San Andres Street in Puerta de Tierra. So they thought they'd just dump the garbage right here. I just want to point something out about what I was talking about before. I said that all these things were in back of the jail, the leprosy barracks and the animal hospital and so forth. This little thing, if you can see it, it now says Archivo General. So what was a long time ago the municipal jail is now the General Archive of Puerto Rico, the main historical archive. So I spent a lot of time there, and I know this neighborhood very well. Back to mangroves. In this period, no one understood the environmental benefits of the unique ecosystem of mangroves. Mangroves can grow in extremely salty conditions. They are home to a lot of animals. They're food sources for others. The trunks and branches of mangroves prevent erosion from waves, and the root system keeps sediment from washing out to sea. So there's something really very, very beneficial to coastal environments, and they're found all over the world. And so it's hopeful, but it's also a little sad that today environmental groups and student groups are actually planting mangroves in a lagoon very near where a little over a century ago they were destroyed and the swampy area was filled in. So here's a picture of some people planting mangroves. So finally, the bubonic plague. So this was a political and physical environment in which the first cases of plague occurred. The first people to fall ill lived in Puerta de Tierra, and they were young, robust men. In fact, the majority of the stricken were men under 30 who worked in construction, on the docks, and storage facilities, in sanitation. Compared to COVID-19, when I tell you how many cases there were, you're going to say, gee, that doesn't sound so bad, and it really doesn't. Of the 50, there were 51 cases in the whole city of San Juan. There were a few outside of San Juan. 39 of them were men, and the oldest was 38 years old. One of the first to die of the disease was a young man named Pedro Colon, who lived in a tenement in Puerta de Tierra called El Carolina. And he was working in construction in a house in the city of San Juan itself. And I should point out that the tenement he lived in was in what was considered the better part of Puerta de Tierra. His cousin, Jesus Caraballo, who was 20, who also lived in the same tenement, became ill and died in a matter of days also in the municipal hospital. They both had high fevers, nausea, and painful inguinal buboes. Of the cases in San Juan determined to be plague, the mortality rate was about 65%, although the number of cases actually may have been considerably higher because there were instances of people hiding patients, and there also were apparently doctors who shielded more prosperous patients from the discomfort and the stigma of being taken to the quarantine hospital. For instance, on June 21st, a young lady attended by a local doctor was said to have symptoms of the plague, but was allowed to be kept under observation outside the hospital. Other patients in prosperous neighborhoods or from good families often did not receive the diagnosis of the plague, even though they were suspicious, such as a man who lived on Calle Fortaleza near the governor's mansion. So there's La Fortaleza, the governor's mansion. There's the street he lived on. So you can see this looks just a little bit different than the poorest areas of Puerta de Tierra. Responsibility for fighting the disease was divided between the US Public Health Service and the insular Servicio de Sanidad, or health service. The US Public Health Service was in charge of eradication, and one of its main activities was to rat-proof dwellings, stores, and warehouses. And you'll read about, I'm not going to say anything more about that because you'll read about rat-proofing and the division of labor between Puerto Rican authorities and US health officials in the report by Richard Creel, which you're going to discuss on Monday. But just to tell you a little bit about it, Richard Creel was a surgeon in the US Public Health Service who worked in San Francisco during the plague outbreak there in 1907 and 1908. And so he was sent to Puerto Rico specifically to oversee parts of the response to the plague. Also, please note for the purposes of Monday's readings, you only have to read pages 1051 to 1056, 1062 to 1064, and 1067 to 1068. I sort of picked out what I thought were the juiciest bits for talking about. But you're more than welcome, of course, to read the whole thing. And it's very interesting, well, at least to me. The local Servicio de Sanidad health service advocated the widespread trapping and poisoning of rats, and residents were paid between 2 and 5 cents for every rat they delivered to authorities. I think if you've read the Marcos Cueto article on Peru, you may remember that they stopped paying for rats because people were actually raising them and selling them to the government. Numerous articles in local dailies specified that the disease could only be spread by fleas that had been in contact with infected rats. But there is still debate about whether dogs and cats could carry the fleas and spread plague. So the policy of the government was that any dogs or cats found in the street would be destroyed. And when they were found loose on the street, cats and dogs were sometimes just incinerated alive. Rather like COVID-19, strict rules of personal hygiene were recommended for all the residents of San Juan and Puerta de Tierra. Whether or not they were able or wished to follow them was another matter. All floors were supposed to be washed every day with a mixture of Cresol and water. Cresol is derived either from coal tar or wood tar, and when it's diluted, it serves as a disinfectant. People were told to keep their possessions, especially their sheets and bedclothes, scrupulously clean, not only to bathe frequently, but also to rub their bodies with animal or vegetable fat, or a mixture of water, petroleum, and phenic acid to keep away fleas. In addition to these policies on personal hygiene, their widespread emptying of homes and patios of garbage and trash was mandated and enforced. Hundreds and hundreds of cartloads of waste were hauled away and burned in incinerators in different parts of Puerta de Tierra. On June 21st, the newspaper La Correspondencia estimated that more than 1,600 cartloads of garbage had been hauled away. Excuse me. Another newspaper at the time, El Tiempo, pointed out that the poor were really bearing the brunt of this household cleanup, and that very often what was being thrown out, or what they were being forced to throw out, might look like garbage to the people who were mandating it, but it could be clothing that people really needed, or pieces of household furniture and things like that. There were also complaints that while the neighbors were being very good about this and cleaning out their homes, the refuse often wasn't picked up for days. First of all, there was a shortage of workers to pick it up. It was not a very tasteful job in the middle of an epidemic. And as I mentioned, the city's main garbage dump, in addition to all these other incinerators, but the main garbage dump was in back of the jail in Puerta de Tierra. And when there were several days of rain, the garbage couldn't be burned. So this, talk about miasmas, this stuff stuck around a long time. The island government hoped to minimize financial damage to shipping and commerce, while simultaneously reassuring the population that the plague was not being transmitted through intra-island shipping. And accomplishing both of these was not easy. The chief of insular police ordered a quarantine between San Juan and outside points, which was designed to create a barrier between the small island that San Juan and Puerta de Tierra were on and the rest of the island. the quarantine was relatively loose because it didn't actually mean people couldn't leave the island, the isleta, the small island, nor would that have been politically or socially possible. Consequently, they set up lines of guards, and these guards were supposed to stop everybody going out and coming in to the Puerta de Tierra, and they were supposed to either inspect all freight they had to make sure it didn't have fleas in it, or the person was supposed to have a certificate showing that it had been, the freight had been fumigated. Once it was known that there was plague in San Juan, continuing passengers on ships that were making a stop in San Juan protested that they didn't want anyone from San Juan to get on board. On the other hand, ships coming from other harbors had to be disinfected before they were allowed to dock. And people traveling from ports that were considered to be dirty, that is where they thought there might be plague, were quarantined on board the ship before they could go ashore. On the other hand, goods being shipped out of Puerto Rico also had to be disinfected, and it was reported in June 21st in La Democracia newspaper that 15,000 boxes of pineapple had arrived in New York ruined because they'd been disinfected. And then the other thing that began to happen was that other countries began to deny Puerto Rican ships the right to dock there, one of the first being the Dominican Republic on June 20th. So these were some of the things that the government was trying to do to minimize the plague. In addition to all of these, there was a vaccine and a serum that were supposed to confer some immunity or some protection against the disease, the Yersin serum and the Hafkin vaccine. Well, they both might have worked a little, but they both had serious disadvantages. The Yersin serum was said to confer relatively immediate immunity, but it lasted a very short time. The injection was painful, and you had to keep getting more injections to maintain your immunity, and each injection was said to hurt more than the last. The Hafkin vaccine could reduce the likelihood that a person would contract the plague, and it could lower the mortality rate if you did contract it. But the drawbacks were the extreme painfulness of the vaccine, and that it took a very long time to confer immunity, about 7 days. And if you were already in the incubation period, it was ineffective. So neither of these were great. So class difference in the plague. The crisis and panic created by the plague exacerbated the differences between the rich and poor. The poor suffered the most from having their possessions destroyed, and there were reports of children and old people scavenging in piles of discarded items and carrying things back to their homes. Newspapers mentioned incidences of the poor using money they needed for food to buy mandated disinfectants, and landlords were accused of passing the cost of rat-proofing onto their impoverished tenants. On the other hand, the rich, who were apparently stricken with plague, frequently managed to escape the indignity and possible health hazards of being interned in the quarantine hospital, because, it was sort of silly on the face of it. First of all, if you were put in the quarantine hospital, you were very likely to get some other disease because there were people with other infectious diseases like TB there. And on top of it, to put a person in the quarantine hospital when the person, him or herself, was not actually the cause of the illness didn't make much sense anyway. So wealthier people were able to avoid this indignity, sometimes by going to private clinics where people would operate on their buboes and say, well, this looks like bubonic plague, but it isn't really. Also, even the way cases were reported in the press reflected the social status of the ill. The better off were usually referred to by their names, and they were dignified by titles. They'd be called La Señorita, El Señor, La Joven. The poor were often just referred to as an individual or as somebody's servant. Often when a wealthy person died, the press was careful to specify that the cause wasn't the plague, even though it had been reported earlier in the press that the person probably had the plague. So people would be said to have succumbed to anemia when they had earlier been believed to have bubonic plague. The control measure that most dramatically affected the poor was the destruction of their homes. And you'll read about Richard Creel's attitude towards destroying homes in his report. The vast majority of the homes razed were in Puerta de Tierra, where the disease originated and where most of the sick people lived. On June 19th, the newspaper El Tiempo asserted, quote, "Last night, various houses of little value in Puerta de Tierra were destroyed by fire. Today, in different parts of the neighborhood, they are pulling down many houses." Now, the destruction of homes took place almost exclusively in Salsipuedes and these other low-lying, very poor areas near the mangrove, even though it was known that these houses in these swampy areas, or these really shacks in these swampy areas, were much less likely to attract rats because they were elevated and there weren't places for rats to burrow. In fact, the majority of the plague cases in Puerta de Tierra were in the crowded but drier and more prosperous area along San Agustin Street, where many of the better off tobacco workers lived. Most of the serious rat harbors were in warehouses and food stores along those streets. So while all of Puerta de Tierra was stigmatized, authorities seem to have assumed that the poorest people who lived in the low-lying areas, many of whom were Black, were the origin of the epidemic. And it's hard to determine the exact number of dwellings that were destroyed, but by going through the newspapers, I think it has to be more than 50 and probably not more than 100. The three main newspapers in San Juan, despite some political differences among their owners, did not take markedly different approaches to the plague, and they all tended to create panic while at the same time claiming they wanted to calm public anxiety. The reporters for La Correspondencia were somewhat more hysterical than the other two. On the first day that the plague was announced, publicly made known on June 19th, La Correspondencia in an editorial called for burning the whole neighborhood down. So in the climate of near hysteria, many wealthier people from San Juan tried to get out of the city. If they were very lucky and very wealthy, they might get on a steamship and go to another country altogether. Most of them weren't that lucky, and by June 24th, the hotels and guest houses in Ponce, city of Ponce on the other side of the island, were said to be completely full of people who had fled San Juan. So here's Ponce, here's San Juan. There was said to be fear in Aguadilla, where a lot of the tobacco workers were from, because people in Aguadilla feared that the tobacco workers would be going back to their home and they would bring the plague with them. And the mayors of a number of other towns, Arecibo, Lares, Ciales, Manatí, Utuado, protested the departure of people from San Juan for other parts of the island, and they demanded the officials stop it. And they particularly said that they should prevent anybody from Puerta de Tierra from leaving, and particularly from coming to their jurisdiction. So this was a problem. On the one hand, yes, these people might bring fleas in their clothing or possessions, but they themselves were not contagious. but they were conceived of as disease carriers. So finally, what the acting governor ended up doing was requiring that people leaving the area of San Juan and Puerta de Tierra have an official health certificate that attested to their good health in order to leave. So the issuance of health certificate reinforced this idea that bubonic plague was spread from person to person. You know, you got something saying I'm healthy. There aren't very many references to people from Puerta de Tierra protesting the demolition of their homes and the destruction of their property. Mostly the poor were praised in the press for their cooperation and their civic responsibility. So we don't really know how the people of Puerta de Tierra felt about being accused of being the source of the plague and being viewed as pariahs in other cities. However, on June 22nd, El Tiempo, the newspaper, reported that a group of neighbors in Puerta de Tierra responded with indignation when it became known that the only house where a contaminated rat had been found up until that time hadn't been touched. And that was the first tenement where those two young men lived, in Carolina. It hadn't been touched, while lots of houses in the much poorer area along the mangroves and the swamps had been pulled down. There also was a protest that was recorded in the press of workers responsible for removing the rubble from raised houses, who were demanding a wage of $1 instead of 75 cents a day. And they refused to work until they were given anti-plague serum. And I mean, certainly they were in a very vulnerable situation, because when you destroy a house and if it had rats in it, the rats all run out. So to conclude, altogether, there were 55 cases of plague in Puerto Rico in 1912. 36 of the victims died. That was about 65% of the people known to be infected. 21 of the cases were in Puerta de Tierra, and the last case was reported on September 13th. Compared to the ravages of the third epidemic in India or China, this is a very low number of cases. And given that antibiotics to fight the disease did not yet exist, the mortality rate was not exceptionally high. I'll just give you an example. It's believed that in China, 24,000 people had the disease between 1894 and 1929, and 90% of them died. So it's not clear if the relatively low number of cases and the comparatively low mortality rate was due to a rapid public health response, particularly maybe rat-proofing buildings and trapping rats. It also could have been partly due to the wrong type of flea, or not the wrong type, but fleas that were not very effective vectors, because a number of fleas were found. Some scientists have also pointed out that the plague tends to die down but not disappear, and it may reappear some years later. And in fact, that's what happened in Puerto Rico. And there was another outbreak in 1921. So we really don't know exactly what worked or why the plague dissipated. After the bubonic plague subsided, Puerta de Tierra suffered through other epidemics. Malaria, terrible measles epidemic in 1917, diphtheria. Environmental conditions were not rapidly changed. This plague really should have been a wake-up call for the government and the medical establishment, as it was to some extent in Peru, as Marcos Cueto talks about in that article. The years of treating Puerta de Tierra as a waste heap came back to haunt the officials and residents of San Juan and other parts of the island in the form of a dread disease. Plague increased the stigma of the neighborhood, while those who suffered the most were its residents. Even though it was generally established science at that time that fleas, not human contact, cause the disease, the prevalence of older theories about miasmas and person-to-person contagion. And the fact that unhygienic homes, warehouses, and stables attracted rats allowed blame for the illness to be cast on the poor, dark-skinned neighbors of Puerta de Tierra. Thank you.
The first question I've got here in the chat from Bess Morales asks, how did they get it through the accidental ingestion of rat droppings or urine? So how was the plague ingested in that way?
It could be, and of course the way they attempted to prevent that was by cleaning everything up, including spreading disinfectant on the streets and things like that. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, but that was not the main way. It probably wasn't the main way it was spread.
The next question we have from Cheryl Billingsley. How would you compare the bubonic plague epidemic in San Juan to COVID-19 and the disparities that we see in the Black and Spanish communities in New York?
Well, it's an obvious comparison. I mean, right now we know that not only are people of color, Latinos, Black people, the ones who are suffering the most from COVID-19, but in many areas they're stigmatized because of it, and also that Asian people are experiencing stigma with all kinds of racist names for COVID-19. So I think that's one obvious comparison. I think there are lots of other comparisons with COVID-19.
I have a question from Jennifer Dykes, who thanks you so much for your fascinating lecture. She points out that you mentioned that the municipal jail is now the archives.
Right.
So she assumes that this means most of Puerta de Tierra neighborhood has been gentrified. When and why did this happen?
Well, that's a great question. Certain parts of Puerta de Tierra have been gentrified. It's an interesting story to the municipal jail because it started out being built as a hospital, then was used as a jail, then became a Bacardi rum warehouse, and finally in the 1970s became the archive. Wow. And at the far end of Puerta de Tierra, there are a number of important municipal buildings and important educational institutions. And those were built sort of from the 1920s on. There's also a very nice park, Munoz Rivera Park, that's right across from where the archive is now. And there are a few luxury condominiums there, which makes sense because it's in a very, very attractive place with water on two sides. On the other hand, Puerta de Tierra has been certainly for a long time and still is considered an unsavory neighborhood. It was a neighborhood where when the shacks and poor housing was finally demolished along the southern shore, lots of housing projects were built. Housing projects were allowed to become completely deteriorated. They became centers of drug dealing. One of them actually was imploded rather than being fixed up. And people felt very, very unsafe in them. So part of Puerta de Tierra is gentrified, and part of it still is poor and fearsome to some people. And I'll give you an example. I was going to the archive once, and I had a rented car, and my windshield got broken. It turned out that my windshield got broken by a coconut that fell off a tree somewhere else. But I drove it to the archive and I parked and I called the rent-a-car company. And I explained where I was and I asked if someone could come help me because I was having trouble seeing out of the windshield. And the first thing the man at the rent-a-car company said to me is, "What are you doing in a terrible neighborhood like Puerta de Tierra?" And I said, "Well, actually I'm working in the archive, but you know, it's not your business." And he refused to come get the car. So Puerta de Tierra is a mixed neighborhood, you know. They're very, very lovely places where rich people live, and they're very poor places.
If I can follow up on that, I've spent some time in San Juan over the last several years, and one thing I have noticed is that you're right. It's very mixed, especially in Puerta de Tierra and Old San Juan. But it often, like, I do sometimes notice that there are real, like, topographical demarcations between the gentrified parts and the poor parts. And it was really interesting how you sort of pointed that out a bit in this is the case 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Is that still the case, or can we talk about it in those terms even still today?
Very clearly poor areas and yeah, it is very clear. The area along different areas, it's San Agustin Street for a very long time had a very bad reputation for being the center of the drug trade. And you could go there and you would see, you saw human evidence of it, people who were on drugs or selling drugs. It's gotten a little better, actually, San Agustin Street. Another really interesting thing is one of the most unique and important public housing projects, known as El Falansterio, was built there in the 1930s, actually in the poorest part of Puerta de Tierra. It's an Art Deco housing project that eventually was for lower middle class, working class people, and they eventually formed an owner's co-op. So you have mixtures of things, you know. They're not in the very fancy part, but they're a national landmark, their housing, you know, so.
I have another question here from, again, from Bess Morales. She's wanted to clarify that even though more affluent folks were contracting the disease at a higher rate, it was the poor who were being blamed as carriers. Is that correct?
Right. I mean, none of these people were wealthy, okay?
Right.
They were all working class. But it was the people who were doing a little better, who lived in the area where there were the most places, where there were the most rats. But they weren't the ones who were blamed. I mean, everybody from Puerta de Tierra was somewhat stigmatized, but they were more likely to be white. They lived in this, what was considered the better neighborhood. And the people who were being blamed, particularly singled out, were the poorest people who lived in an area where there was very little plague. So.
There's a question from Jason O'Connor. Did the plague spread to other communities outside of Puerta de Tierra?
Not very far. There was a case in Carolina, which is a few miles out of San Juan. I think there were a couple of cases in Santurce, which is part of San Juan. But no, it didn't spread across the island, even though everyone was scared it would.
Nadia Mohammed asks that, or she asks, is the plague the same disease as the Black Death? We know that it is, but maybe another way of asking this question is, you know, you're talking about the disease in the 20th century. Does it carry the same cultural, you know, connotations? Did people make those connections even at that time?
Well, a lot of, yes. See, I mean, there's debate about this, and I think Professor Varlick brought this up in her talk, that for a long time we've been talking about 3 plague epidemics: the plague of Justinian, the Black Death in the Middle Ages, and then this 3rd epidemic that started in Hong Kong in 1894. Now what I think scientists are finding and historians are finding by using Middle Eastern sources is that maybe the Black Death, or the 2nd plague epidemic, just continued. There continued to be flare-ups in the Middle East. And so maybe it's a misnomer to call this one the 3rd epidemic, when in some places in the world it may have been going on on all along, and when it apparently has the same biological makeup. So that's an issue that's being discussed.
Excellent, thank you. I have a question from Julia Morales Aboud. She thanks you for your presentation. She is wondering if you can comment on how the locals are able or were able to practice good hygiene when they were living in substandard housing developments or without access to potable clean water. And did the United States provide support and education to the locals on the importance of maintaining and practicing good hygiene during this time?
Well, the hygiene angle was pretty much handled by the local Puerto Rican authorities. And of course, it was very, very hard. I mean, you could see those things I was talking about would be almost impossible for many people to do. There was this widespread, you know, throwing out of garbage, and people were supposed to wash their floors every day. Whether they were able to do it is unclear. They probably weren't. Certain streets they would disinfect the street with some kind of disinfectant, and they would, you know, fumigate, usually with sulfur packages and things. But no, it was very, very hard.
Those are all the questions I have in the chat for the moment, but we might give it a few minutes to see if anyone else has further questions. If I could ask one, I noticed it was really interesting to think about the timing of this epidemic sort of coinciding with the Jones Act and the granting of citizenship to Puerto Ricans. Folks may be familiar too with that act because it did more than just grant citizenship to Puerto Ricans, but it implanted all of these strange, like, protectionist measures on U.S. commerce and so many other things. And it came back into the news for Puerto Rico during the hurricane, which, you know, it's one aspect of the law is it makes it very difficult for ships that were not made in the United States to travel between U.S. ports, and in a situation where a ton of humanitarian aid is needed, it makes it very difficult for aid to get in. I'm wondering if that's had any impact on other epidemics or public health emergencies, you know, in Puerto Rico since then.
Since, you mean, well,
Since 1917.
You're talking about Hurricane Maria. So,
well, sure.
Yeah, yeah. No, it has, and from time to time, the U.S. has had to suspend that aspect of the Jones Act because it's just too cruel, you know, and because it also controls not just humanitarian aid, but trade. So, yeah, but I'm not sure, and I can't tell you right now exactly when it's had to be suspended. They did have to suspend it during Maria.
Right.
And possibly, I don't know, possibly during these earthquakes too, because Puerto Rico has had a series of horrible earthquakes, and now of course it's decimated by COVID-19, so.
That's right. Yeah, I hadn't seen that, but yeah, that's right. That's right. A question from Megan Jones. Was there any discussion about the 1912 plague in the US, and what was the language that was used? What effect might it have had on Puerto Rican immigrants to the United States and attitudes about them in the United States?
You know, I really don't know. Something for me to look up or for her to look up. It didn't last very long. It was, obviously the US was worried. The US Public Health Service was worried enough to send one of their more specialized people there to help deal with it. But I don't know. It'd be interesting to look at the US press and see what was being said.
Peter, I don't know if you have any questions.
I maybe I could get a little political. Before you came on this morning, and I was mentioning to some of us who were on earlier that I noticed some very shocking but interesting parallels of then with today. In the Cueto article, for example, page 14, there's this statement as people were trying to combat the plague. On page 14, here's the quote: "To stop the measure, the interested parties questioned the very existence of the plague and held that the workers in the mill had died from suffocation." And then the article ends, pages 20 to 21, with Chinese residents being blamed.
Right.
And I just couldn't help but notice the parallels with today. Seems like these are tropes that continue to be repeated. I just wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, certainly that's very clear in the Cueto article. And, you know, Peru had a large Asian population who were among the poorest people in the country. So yeah, there's this denial of the disease. And it's interesting, I don't want to scoop the reading, but Creel in his piece praises the Puerto Rican government and their health officials for, or maybe he's really praising the US health officials who were there for announcing it right away and in a very forthright way, not trying to hide it. On the other hand, that's not quite true, because if it's clear from archival documents and stuff that they waited as long as they could before they finally said it was plague. But there wasn't this kind of, denial, like this is nothing, or, you know, most people have very light cases, and, you know, that we've seen here.
I have a question here from Katharina Kempf. She says, this is a more personal question. How did you make the leap from working on Bolivia to working on Puerto Rico? And in your research across Latin America, which countries stand out as having a particularly good or bad response to a disease or epidemic?
Say that last part again.
In your research across Latin America, which countries stand out as having a particularly good or particularly bad response to a disease or an epidemic, like bubonic plague?
Well, right. I don't know about every country in Latin America. Certainly right now, Brazil's doing a really bad job. But how did I make the leap? I made a leap of country, but I think what I notice about myself and about most historians is that you always tend to be interested in similar issues. And I had long been interested in Puerto Rico. And even though my earlier work had been in labor, history of colonial labor, I feel like a lot of the issues that I bring up about class and race and gender and the environment are in all of my work. So I don't know. But in terms of doing a good job, you know, there's so many epidemics, and so many, but you know, in this same Marcos Cueto book where he writes about the return of the epidemic, the last article in there is about the recent, fairly recent cholera epidemic of 1990s. And that's an example of even overcoming very serious obstacles. Peru did a really good job because their medical workers did a really good job, and they didn't try to hide it. They addressed it for what it was. Other countries in Latin America in that cholera epidemic did not do such a good job because they kept pretending it didn't exist. It was just a little diarrhea or something. Perhaps I should have mentioned which ones those were, but
Okay, I have one question from Bess Morales again. Out of curiosity, from the archives, are there any newspaper articles published from then and that she might be able to share regarding the bubonic plague? Are the newspaper reports, some of which you mentioned, are they accessible online at all, or are they all archival?
Well, I'll tell you, do a little searching, you might find them online.
Mhm.
I actually did that part of my research at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, which is part of Hunter College in New York. And they have microfilms of most of the major Puerto Rican newspapers going back, I'm not quite sure how far, but they may be online. I would just, you know, look around, go and online and see what's been put up.
Excellent.